I'm Mary Williams Stover, and I have the pleasure of serving as Executive Director of the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement. The Council for Women and Youth Involvement is proud to partner today with the International Center for Research on Women, and we are committed to raising awareness of the issues faced by women and girls in North Carolina. We welcome you today to this event where we will uncover this important research on the status of not only what we can do to protect girls and to empower women and girls to live their full life and their full potential. Much of our work involves helping youth to become leaders and to do everything that we can to help them thrive and become full adults. I am very honored to introduce to you the Department of Administration Secretary, Michelle Sanders, a native of Belhaven and also appointed by Governor Cooper in 2017, and most recently appointed to chair the Andrea Harris Social, Economic, Environmental, and Health Equity Task Force. It is my pleasure to introduce you, Secretary Sanders.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. And good afternoon to everyone. I would first like to commend the International Center for Research on Women and the Tahiri Justice Center for their continued commitments to this critical work and research on behalf of women and young girls. Thank you for bringing us together today around such an important topic for our state. The North Carolina Department of Administration's Council for Women and Youth Involvement is proud to be partnering with you in support of this work. As many of you are aware, just last week, in honor of Governor Cooper's proclamation recognizing Women's Equality Day in North Carolina, the Council for Women and Youth Involvement released its full 2020 Status of Women in North Carolina report on political participation. The report is the third of 4 to be released by the Council to bring awareness to key issues affecting the lives of women in North Carolina. Other reports look at where North Carolina women rank in employment and earnings, health and wellness, and poverty and opportunity. What these reports have revealed is that while North Carolina is making headway in supporting women's issues in some areas, we as a state have a lot more work to do. For instance, the Status of Women in North Carolina Employment and Earnings released in 2018 indicates that women who earn high school diplomas earn more than women without a high school diploma. And traumatic life events such as early childhood marriage, pregnancy, and sexual assault and violence can disrupt a young girl's educational outcome and often negatively impacts her life in other areas longer term. Now, based on the composite index of key indicators, North Carolina has been graded with C's and D's for employment for earnings, health and wellness, and political participation. And I don't know about you, but having been raised by 2 North Carolina educators and also the mother of twin girls, I know, or I'd say, that C's and D's are never acceptable grades in the home, and especially when there's a potential to do better. And we know this state can do better. So while we're working and we're making progress in some areas, we know we need to do better, and we know that we can do better. The Council for Women and I continue working with state partners to bring awareness to these issues and to do all we can do to improve North Carolina's scores in these areas, and most importantly, to improve the lives and the status of women in the state of North Carolina, to be the best state in the country for women to live and thrive. Our administration cares deeply about the well-being of all people in the state, but particularly we work hard to advocate for and lift up women, children, and young people. The governor's priority initiatives and policies that support the overall health, economy, and quality of life for everyone living in the state so that they can be better educated, have more money in our pockets, and live a more abundant and prosperous life is what we work diligently towards every day. But this report on child marriage in North Carolina shines a light on an alarming trend. Before I learned of the report findings on child marriage in North Carolina, I, maybe like some others, assumed that child marriage was an issue of the past or culturally specific, or likely more prevalent in other countries that experience even more poverty than we do in the US, maybe where there's a struggle with other social issues. But I was shocked to learn that not only are child marriages still happening right here in the United States, but that North Carolina may rank among the top 5 states for the highest rates of child marriage, and is one of the 2 states tied for setting the lowest legal age of marriage in the country. And what this report has brought to light is that our antiquated state laws are contributing to this problem, allowing marriage license applications between children and adults, sometimes with age gaps of 10 years or more. Lyric Thompson with ICRW, the Institute of Research, and I think I forgot the rest that quickly, who you will hear from next, first talked with me about the ideal of doing this research back in 2018, when we were both surprised to learn that North Carolina had among the lowest marriage age laws in the country, yet could not account for exactly how many children are still being married in the state. With all the data tracking that occurs today, it was unthinkable that we had no existing research on this. And of course, to tackle this issue, we first needed to understand it better and to have data to inform our path and our decisions and our actions forward. As necessity is often the mother of invention, Lyric and the International Center for Research on Women set out to help to do just that. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Lyric, who will talk to you about her involvement in this project and the work that has been done and what we can do as a community to help all of our young girls here in North Carolina who are at risk of this, I call it a tragedy. So at this time, I'll pass it to you, Lyric.
Thank you so much, Secretary Sanders, to you and to Mary and all of the council staff and members who have been just incredible collaborators on this and helping us get the news about this study out there and helping us conceptualize from the very beginning all those couple of years ago. It takes a village to do this work and this study in particular, and you're going to hear from our town council today. You've already heard, of course, from Secretary Sanders and Mary Williams Stover, our North Carolina Council for Women Executive Director, on which I'm also privileged to serve. I'd like to also thank our fellow speakers who you'll hear from next, who have been just absolutely essential to us being able to get this from idea to, we hope, impact. And my co-author on this paper, Mara Steinhaus, who you can also hear from next month on a webinar we're doing for Day of the Girl, talking more about impact of child marriage on various health and development issues that I'll talk briefly about, but she'll give you the full spiel. We wouldn't be here today, of course, without the generosity of Easter Maynard, who has funded this work and made this research possible. So I am so pleased as the Senior Director for the Policy Shop at the International Center for Research on Women and a Council for Women member to be the person who will share the results with you today. But I want to just underscore that it is something that we've wanted to do, as Secretary Sanders has suggested, for some years. ICRW, my organization, does come at this issue from a history of having put it on the map internationally. As Secretary Sanders has alluded, I think a lot of us think of this as an over there problem and not an everywhere problem, and certainly not a here problem. But another person that you'll hear from in just a bit, Jeannie Smoot, who is the country's leading legal mind on age of marriage laws, is also a daughter of North Carolina and someone I had done some advocacy with in Washington on a coalition that we chair called Girls Not Brides USA. Most of that advocacy had looked at this prevalence internationally, 12 million girls a year marrying in the low and middle income countries where we actually have much better data than we do in the United States. But she was sharing that North Carolina was one of 6 states that doesn't actually have publicly available data at that time. And as Secretary Sanders has just shared, we are now tied for lowest legal age of marriage set by statute with Alaska at 14 in cases of pregnancy or parenting. Jeannie will talk to you more about the legal dimensions of this. I'm mostly here to just tell you the facts. But what we hope to do today is give you a sense of the full story of how we got here and what we found and what we can do about it. I think in our decades of research on this issue internationally, and now I'm so proud as a Raleigh resident and a child of North Carolina in the United States to be able to say it is happening here and there are solutions of all the issues that we work on, and we work on gender-based violence and health and education, so many issues that can seem overwhelming. This is really one that is preventable. It's endable. We have tested the solutions. We know how changing those marriage laws that allow a child marriage, keeping girls in school, and trying to help families who are on the verge and help them avoid having to make really unthinkable trade-offs between their children's futures and immediate needs. So as I mentioned, North Carolina, the story started with a conversation between Jeannie and I about how we had an evidence gap in the state. And that was something that the International Center for Research on Women really wanted to help answer. But because data is not collected at the state level in North Carolina, it is collected and stored differently in each of our 100 counties, we needed to start there. We had to start by going out to the registers of deeds, who are the local government officials tasked with receiving and approving marriage applications, to see if they would share that data so we could get an accurate picture of whether or not this was still happening. So that's where the story really starts. I'd like to hand it over to Drew Reisinger, who is the Buncombe County Register of Deeds, and one of the first stops on our quest to see how we could uncover some answers to this question. Drew, over to you.
Hey, Lyric, thank you so much for the introduction. And it's an honor to be here with y'all today. So my name is Drew Reisinger, and I'm the Register of Deeds over in Asheville, North Carolina for Buncombe County. I've been in office for almost a decade, and over that time, I've been concerned about this issue. After seeing vulnerable young girls coming into my office to get married, it has become a goal of mine to raise the age of marriage. When I approached legislators about this, they asked for data. Time after time, sympathetic legislators who had good intentions and they wanted to help said, we really can't do anything until you show us the data, Drew. So back in 2000, when the law was changed, raising the age to 14 years old as the floor for marriage in the state of North Carolina, the state stopped keeping this marriage data that Lyric just told you about. So if we can't prove something is happening, we can't get legislators to change it. So I decided that I wanted to see what I could do to help. So I reached out to Hooray, I think I got that right, Jeannie, after seeing their legislative victory in Georgia. They put me in touch with the ICRW as they were planning on trying to figure out what Lyric just told you of how we eliminate this gap in data. So we realized that there was a challenge in front of us. Together, we called my Register of Deeds colleagues across the state of North Carolina, trying to see who had clean, digitized data that we could get access to that went all the way back to the year 2000. We were able to find 50 counties out of 100 North Carolina counties who had this accessible data. I could not have done this without the help of my fellow registrars of deeds. I know there's a handful of y'all on the call. Thank you so much. These counties are a mix of rural and urban counties from the mountains to the coast, and we feel that it is a good representation of our state. The numbers are staggering that we found. This happens so much more often than we thought it did too. One troubling trend that I'm seeing in Buncombe County is that now our surrounding states around Western North Carolina specifically have all raised their age, and our out-of-state applicants are coming in much more, the curve is going like this. It's in the wrong direction. And we've essentially become a destination for those seeking to get out of their state laws. Yes, we've essentially become a sanctuary state for statutory rape. So just last year, I got a phone call that there was a couple in my office from Kentucky that came here to get a marriage license. The man was 49 years old and the girl had just turned 17. Kentucky has recently raised their age to 18, so the couple knew that the one place that they could come to was North Carolina, specifically because of our low age. So I was in the middle of compiling this data with the ICRW when this couple came in. So I was well aware of all the negative impacts that child marriage could have on young women at this time. So I asked the girl's mother if I could speak to the daughter alone to ask her a few questions. The mother allowed it, and I asked this girl if she had finished high school yet, and she hadn't. I asked her if she'd ever worked a job, and she hadn't. I asked her if she'd ever lived on her own and had the capacity to do that, and she said she never has. I told her with the risks associated with getting married this young, and that she was at a heightened risk for domestic violence and other negative outcomes in life. The situation felt bad enough for me that I didn't want to help aid and abet in a felony offense since they came to North Carolina specifically to get around their own state laws. So I denied their request. Legally, this is complicated for me. It's not something I want to do, and it's not something I want the state of North Carolina to put, situation I want the state of North Carolina to put us in. And realistically, this couple was able to go to another county on their way back to Kentucky, and they got a license in North Carolina, and a North Carolina magistrate judge issued them, a register of deeds issued them a license, and the magistrate judge married them that day. So the North Carolina General Assembly needs to raise the age so that myself and my colleagues in Register of Deeds office have the law to back us up. But more importantly, we need to protect the lives and the livelihoods of these girls that are here in North Carolina that need our support. Thank you all for being here today. And if I can be of help or answer more questions later, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Drew. And that, I think, sets a really nice context for the why of the study. And then I'd like to share the what and what we found with your help and the 49 other counties who were able to share data. I'm going to use a few slides here to just sort of illustrate the data for you. And then Jeannie will take it over from me to talk about the legal dimensions. So for methodology, I'd like to share that our scope, as Drew has already alluded, was 50 counties who were able to provide the marriage license applications that had been taken from the year 2000 to 2019 and share with us either directly or in some cases they have external data vendors who did that. I'd like to stress that no personal identifying information was shared. We were just looking to see what was the age of marriage and of both parties. So we looked at all of those records for those 50 counties and checked to ensure that the ages of both applicants were recorded there, that they were entered correctly, and that at least one applicant was a minor, so under 18, when the application was submitted. We removed anything that wasn't correctly entered, and not all counties provided data for all years. So I'd like to underscore that this is definitely an underestimate. So in total, as mentioned, we received the data for that 19-year period from 50 counties, representing 43% of the population of North Carolina in 2018. And then the goal, one of the goals of the study, was to be able to estimate statewide prevalence. So what we did there was we assumed the same rate of marriage in the other 50 counties and extrapolated by population size for those counties so that we could then add those two numbers together to get a statewide estimate. I'd like to underscore here that we are confident that although we have 50 counties reporting here, this is an underestimate. We didn't receive complete data for all of those counties, and I think the findings speak for themselves. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Thousands of children are indeed marrying. This is between the period of 2000 and 2019. We saw nearly 4,000 marriage license applications that involved just over 4,000 minors. So that number, that second number, is a little bigger because in some cases it was 2 minors marrying each other, but the overwhelming majority is a minor marrying an adult. Extrapolating that by population, and again, assuming the same rate of child marriage in the remaining 50 counties and looking at population sizes, that total estimate would put North Carolina among the top 5 states in the nation in terms of overall numbers, with Texas, Florida, Kentucky, and just ahead of Alabama. And I should note here, I think there should be a graphic, that many of those states have recently fixed their laws, and Jeannie will talk more about that in a moment. So we could actually very well be increasing in terms of our ranking here. In terms of the data source for the comparison data, that was the most comprehensive statewide comparison was assembled by PBS Frontline. So that was our estimation looking at those county records compared against the PBS Frontline data on the previous slide. So as mentioned, I just want to underscore here that the overwhelming majority of those marriage applications were between a minor and an adult. I think there is a tendency or a real desire, an understandable desire to think that this is the case of a couple of 17-year-olds, a Romeo and Juliet scenario of 2 kids getting married who really love each other and want to do that. Not that it actually worked out very well for Romeo and Juliet, I guess, but the point is that's not what we found at all. In 93% of these applications, it was an adult seeking to marry a minor. And in the next slide, we can look at the age gaps, which were very large. The largest of which was a 40-year age difference between a 57-year-old and a 17-year-old. And then for those applications of 15 and under, the findings were in direct conflict with the state statutory rape laws. So we're saying here that in 57% of the cases for 15 and under, those marriages were sanctioning unions where the sex would otherwise have been a felony offense under state statutory rape laws, excuse me. And then, as you heard from Drew and his experience in Buncombe County, we have both anecdotal evidence, and then he has actually done some empirical analysis in recent years in his county, suggesting that North Carolina is in fact becoming a destination for child marriage as our neighbors and surrounding states are fixing their laws, closing legal loopholes like ours. Those folks are coming to the state. And in Drew's analysis of his county in particular, that shift was from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 in recent years, out-of-state applicants, as corresponding with the years in which those laws were changed in the other states. I'm gonna close on this annex of the counties that are represented in the study, because I know we have a lot of folks registered from specific counties, registers of deeds. Again, thank you to those of you who participated in and shared your records, as well as guardian ad litem and other folks I know, and representatives. You'll want to know, was your county represented? So here you have it, very good mix in terms of statewide, regional, urban, rural, and we don't have everybody, but I just want to underscore here that the counties who participated largely participated because they had data records that were available, digitized, and able to share. Those who did not, it's not necessarily opposition to participating, just to underscore every single of 100 counties collects and stores these data differently, and some are not even digitized. So that is why we have what we have here, but we are very confident that we know that this is a conservative estimate, given that even the counties who participated did not supply all years, and we removed anything where data wasn't entered correctly or there were any questions. So this is a conservative estimate. Further data would be great, but we know it's a problem. We know it's happening. One would be too many, and we know how to fix it. So for that portion of the conversation, I'd like to turn to my friend and a woman I've learned so much from about age of marriage law and all those things, the Senior Counsel for Policy and Strategy at the Tahereh Justice Center, a fellow daughter of North Carolina, Jeannie Smoot. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lyric. Can everybody hear me? I had some technical trouble earlier. Okay, great. So thank you. The Tahereh Justice Center is a national nonprofit that for over 20 years has provided legal and social services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other abuse like forced and child marriage. And for the last several years, we've been leading national efforts to try to address those problems in the US. A few years ago, as Lyric mentioned, some advocates and investigative reporters began to dig into other states' marriage license records like these. Can we see the next slides, a couple up and down? And the composite picture that began to emerge, even without records from states like North Carolina as yet, was truly stunning. In the US between 2000 and 2015, nearly 250,000 minors, defined in most states as children under the age of 18, were married. And in the North Carolina data that is just emerging, we see some of the same consistent red flags that we saw nationwide. Some very young minors being married, some very large age differences, and other dynamics of sharp concern. And we realize that not every marriage under the age of 18 is forced as such, but for many reasons in our work, we see substantial overlap. Among other things, minors simply don't have the same legal rights an adult would have, say, to leave home or to get a protective order on their own. In addition, they lack the same practical resources and options an adult would have to protect themselves. And so that is a very real and serious concern in these cases. Next slide. The other truth that has been emerging over this period is that, marriage under the age of 18 is contrary to a girl's best interests. Let's look at some of those illustrative stats. There are 50%, you're 50% more likely to drop out of high school if you marry under the age of 18, and you're 4 times less likely not to complete college. These marriages face up to 80% divorce rates and a much greater likelihood of future poverty. And in fact, teen mothers who marry and later divorce, as is likely, can face more than double the likelihood of future poverty. And some of that is related to childbearing. Teens who marry under the age of 18 are 3 times more likely to have 5 or more children. The list goes on and on. There's an increased risk of medical problems, 23% greater risk of heart attack, diabetes, cancer, or stroke, some mental health disorders at rates 3 times higher than in the general population amongst child brides in the US. And so these concerns lead us to re-examine North Carolina's laws. Next slide. As Drew pointed out, the last time they were touched was 20 years ago. This is before many of these studies came on the scene with this strong evidence and data that should prevent these marriages from happening. And the current law in North Carolina says that if you're 16 and 17, you can get married with simple parental consent. If you're under that age, there must be a pregnancy or you must already have given birth to a child. And the court in those cases appoints a guardian ad litem. This is someone who is meant to represent the minor's best interests in court. And in North Carolina, that has to be an attorney. The statute spells out a number of other criteria as well. But let's look at how that then places North Carolina in the emerging national landscape. And the truth is that it's having North Carolina fall further and further behind. North Carolina is now in the shrinking minority of states that has such a low statutory age floor. There are a total of only 5 in that category. There are only 5 states, including North Carolina, that still have a pregnancy exception. And you can see how both of these would undermine statutory rape laws. They put the age of consent to marriage below the age of consent to sex, and they work at cross purposes with other laws meant to protect vulnerable minors from coercion. Let's talk about coercion for a minute. That parental exception simply gives the final say-so often to a parent who could be abusive, neglectful, or outright exploitative. And the judicial approval exceptions, even though they are pretty decently detailed in the North Carolina statute, they don't apply to all minors, only to the youngest ones. And in addition, the evidence we now have from ICRW's research is that they're not working. In over half of the cases, what was squarely before the court, before the judge, before the GAL, and they must have turned a blind eye to, was a felony offense, a pregnancy that resulted from a statutory rape, and a marriage license application was approved instead. So where does that bring us in terms of what we should do about all this? Next slide, please. There are substantial reasons, obviously, to consider it high time to look again at those laws and to strengthen the safeguards to protect vulnerable girls from these serious lifelong harms. We know more now, frankly, and with that understanding comes an obligation to close those protection gaps. And as Lyric mentioned, as Drew mentioned, the urgency is growing too because North Carolina's neighbors, many other Southern Legislative Conference states, have moved to close some of those gaps. And again, as they snap into action, North Carolina's inaction is putting girls at sharper risk. Next slide, please. In the last 5 years, in fact, 25 states in total have enacted reforms, bipartisan reforms, to end or limit marriage under the age of 18, and 4 now draw the line at 18, no exceptions, as the minimum marriage age. The laws vary, but they reflect these very common and very real concerns about how these marriages can be cover-ups for abuse and exploitation or enable that to happen. Next slide. The Tahirih Justice Center's position, therefore, is that the best, strongest protection for a girl is to set that minimum marriage age at 18, no exceptions. It's also the easiest line for states to implement and to enforce. But we urge that any alternative reforms have to set high bars, put in place meaningful safeguards. You can't just tick the box with surface level solutions. In effect, no one who is legally and practically still a child should be permitted to marry. It's a simple but very powerful proposition. And you can see in these comparative outcomes from different states that the shape laws take make a huge difference. States that have limited exceptions pretty narrowly to court emancipated minors after a special hearing have seen a 90% drop in the numbers of minors who are married. States that simply raised age floors or put in place some max age differences experienced much less robust outcomes. And states that do less will see less, like zero change potentially. So we're grateful in North Carolina to be working with McGuire Woods to pursue legislative change, and we welcome allies who are seeking strong bipartisan solutions with us. So turning to the last slide here. I've given you a lot of dense information in a short period of time, but I want to bring our focus back to the individual impact, the lifelong impact on someone's life and the trajectory that could have been. You see here quotes from a child marriage survivor who wrote us about how her alcoholic and abusive mother basically pushed her into a marriage at age 16 to get her out of the house, to get rid of her. What you see reflected here, the powerlessness that is pervasive in these comments, I had nowhere to go, no one to confide in, that is unconscionable. The abuse she suffered for years afterwards is unthinkable. But with your help, we can prevent that from happening in North Carolina and around the country. So thank you very much for your attention. And it's now my honor to turn the mic over to my friend and fellow advocate, Donna Pollard. She is a truly inspiring survivor of child marriage herself, and with whom we partnered in her home state of Kentucky to enact some historic reforms there in 2018. And Donna is now a national movement leader, driving change in other states around the country. Thank you very much, and Donna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. You know, despite beginning to speak publicly about my experience as a child marriage survivor back in 2016, when I continue to hear data reflecting children marrying adults, including children being taken across state lines to take advantage of states where they have more relaxed laws around child marriage, quite frankly, I'm completely heartbroken because I know firsthand the devastatingly disturbing lifelong impact that child marriage can have on not only the individual child, but her children that result from that marriage. Now, before I share with you my personal experience, I think it's important that you understand how vulnerable I was to being married off at 16 simply because of the family that I was born into. As far back as I can trace, back to the year 1814, every single generation in my maternal lineage was married before their 18th birthday. And some of the women, including my mother, were as young as 13 years old. Now, because of my mother's own child marriage, she ended up growing up with an 8th grade level education, and she continued to live in poverty with mental health challenges that were both undiagnosed and untreated. This led to her abusing me physically and emotionally, and my father was hardly ever around because he was a long-distance truck driver. But still, I felt a closer bond with him rather than the woman that would beat and neglect me more days than not during my childhood. My father was diagnosed with advanced stage lung cancer when I was 12 and ended up passing away when I was 13. And I had no coping skills at that time to deal with any of it. Not the abuse that I had suffered, not him getting sick and me having to take care of him, not his death. And this resulted in me being admitted to a behavioral health facility for treatment when I was 14. Now, instead of receiving the help that I so desperately needed at that age, that facility ended up having a perpetrator that worked there as a mental health technician. He was 29 years old. Again, I was 14. He began grooming me in the facility. He had access to all of my files, so he knew that my father had passed away just months before. He knew how insecure and starved for love and attention I was. And so, again, that made me incredibly vulnerable to fall for his manipulation, that he was so in love with me and that our relationship was different because I was so mature. And as any 14-year-old, I fell for that, thinking that, hopefully somebody finally was showing me affection and attention. And so I internalized everything that he told me as truth because I was so desperate to believe it. I ended up moving to Kentucky when I was discharged from that facility, and this man continued to live in the state of Indiana. We would still see each other every weekend for 2 years because either my mother would drive me up to meet with him or he would drive down to be with me. My mother would leave me alone with him for hours at a time, and the hotel staff where I was taken never questioned why a 14 and 15-year-old girl were checking into this hotel room with a grown man in his 30s for hours. Just after I turned 16, my mother consented to me marrying him, and at that time he was nearly 31. I was still a resident of Kentucky at the time, and he drove down from Indiana to take me to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, where he thought that we could get married without question since Pigeon Forge is known for quick weddings. He was right. I ended up having to drop out of high school before I completed my 10th grade year and lost a very substantial scholarship that I had been awarded because of that. The day after the wedding, when he took me to his new apartment up in Indiana, I tried to enroll in the high school up there that was just up the street from the apartment complex I was living in, but the assistant principal would not allow it because she said that it would only be a matter of time before I would become pregnant, and they just couldn't have that at their school. So, of course, my educational opportunities were completely disrupted. I ended up having to work full-time to support my 31-year-old husband who would spend his days getting high and drunk. And even though I tried to escape at both 16 and 17, I was refused housing by 2 apartment complexes because I could not enter into a contract with them legally. I was even refused refuge in a domestic violence shelter because I had not yet reached the age of majority. When I was 16, I became pregnant for the first time, and I miscarried. I could have died 2 weeks after that happened because I spiked a fever from all the remaining toxins in my body. And it took 2 days of me begging my perpetrator to take me to the hospital and consent to my medical care for me to be able to go and get the antibiotics that I needed. I became pregnant again when I was 17, and my daughter was born just about a month after my 18th birthday. I spent my 18th birthday heavily pregnant, taken to a strip club by my perpetrator for his gratification. And shortly after I gave birth, I was made to start working there. I had no credibility, and he made sure that I was never going to. When I was finally able to leave, I was not in any position to take care of a baby while I was still just a kid myself, and at that point living in public housing. The judge ended up awarding custody of my child to my perpetrator. And at that time, my perpetrator was a college graduate in his 30s. The court also awarded him child support to be paid by me. At that point in time, a 20-year-old high school dropout and statutory rape victim, barely making above minimum wage. Let me be very clear here. The institutions and legal system of Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee failed me and my child tremendously. And any other state in our nation, including North Carolina, that does not have protections in place to prevent children from being married off in situations that lead to their exploitation, are failing children and families. We cannot possibly address issues of domestic violence and poverty and inaccessibility to educational opportunities to break those cycles if we do not pass common sense legislative reform. And we also have to stop letting perpetrators hide their offenses behind a marriage license. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Donna, for sharing this powerful and disturbing testimony with us today, and for your incredible voice and advocacy in helping legislators in Kentucky address that issue in your home state. It's so significant and poignant to me to hear this story, knowing the example that Drew has shared with us of the Kentucky couple that had a similar age spread that he saw in his county, and further to know that we're neck and neck with Kentucky in terms of numbers. So I'm grateful that you are standing in solidarity with North Carolina women and girls, and grateful for your perspective that I think brings home this issue for us. We're very grateful. If we'll indulge a few questions, I've seen a number coming through the question and answer function. Anyone who would like to ask a question but hasn't already submitted, please do so. We're keeping a running list, and we're going to get through as many as we can, but we only have an hour before we lose the esteemed panelists, and so we may not get to all of them, but we will do our best. I'm doing some bucketing on my end, and we'll try to address multiple questions on the same theme to save a bit of time. And then I think Secretary Sanders will close us out at the end. So let's turn to what we have here. Number of questions. Thank you all speakers for sharing your expertise and your insights. Jeannie, several questions on legislative dimensions here that I'm gonna bucket a couple of for you. And there's also a couple of questions that I can just quickly address before we get into sort of the more in-depth conversation about how we structure response in terms of the data. A lot of folks wanting to know about what's the difference in terms of are the minors girls or boys? Are young men marrying older women? Are young girls being married to older men, etc.? In this study, and excuse that, we only, as I mentioned at the top, only received non-identifying information. So we didn't see gender, race, any of the sort of demographic issues that some folks are questioning in the chat. What we do know from our research in other contexts, so not this study specifically, this one was just age of marriage for both parties. What we do know from other work that we've done over the years is that it's overwhelmingly, disproportionately, younger spouse is girl and older spouse is male. And that I think is certainly the dimension of the power dynamic that you've heard about in Donna's story. It does happen. There are some males below the age of 18 who do marry, but it's much smaller in terms of proportions. Overwhelming majority are girls. Again, that's not this study, that's other research that we've done. We also see that this issue takes place across pretty much every demographic spread in terms of religion, race, region, and so that I think is also data that's available on the ICRW website. Some questions about whether data is going to be publicly available. The studies are on our website now. The individual county records will not be shared publicly. Those will be ICRW's property that have been agreed to be shared from the participating vendors and registers of deeds as per our research agreement. So, Jeannie, I'm going to move to you to answer a couple of things that folks want to know here about how, and Drew as well, because I think Drew has also mentioned, if he didn't mention today, he did in his op-ed, which you should check out on the Asheville Citizen Times website, some other legislative vehicles in the state raised the age. When did the age increase to 14? What was it before? It was actually increased in 2000. What was it before? And then what rights do minors have if they don't want to marry, but the parents give consent? Related question, wouldn't parental consent be in the best interest of the child? Jeannie, Donna, Drew, I'd love for you all to opine on some of those issues.
If I can kick it off then. So a couple of things that come to mind. I've seen in the question threads this question of what rights do minors have, what rights do they need? And some of the core rights that we see in our work that are necessary and denied to minors before they reach that age of majority at age 18 are the ability to leave home, to get a place of their own. Donna mentioned this, to enter contracts, to sign a lease, to contract in any number of ways with from a landlord to a lawyer, right? For a cell phone, to buy a car, all these sorts of things that enable you to navigate life on an equal footing with a partner or just on your own. So because minors don't have those rights, and in fact, there are some laws that kind of prevent minors from exercising them. There's a provision, a criminal provision, where you can't contribute to the delinquency of a minor in North Carolina. So that could be interpreted to penalize someone who even tries to give a minor a safe place to stay, who's trying to leave a home where they're being forced into a marriage. So also in North Carolina, to get either of the two kinds of protective orders, a guardian ad litem typically, and usually a parent, has to be the one backing up that petition for the minor on their behalf. Now, once you are married in North Carolina and in a few other states, you are automatically emancipated. But that empowerment comes far too late for someone who needed it to prevent a marriage they didn't want in the first place. And in addition, in our work, even when that's the case, even in states like North Carolina that automatically emancipate a minor upon marriage, that's pretty poorly understood generally, right? Everybody has this refrain in mind: when I'm 18, I can do what I want. Until you're 18, you'll do what I say, right? It's a magic dividing line. And so even some shelters that we've encountered and others in states where they should have been able to take in a minor as an adult may, for those reasons or other reasons, decide not to offer assistance. So there are an awful lot of both legal rights that are limited and practical options that are constrained for minors not only as they try to resist a marriage, and as you saw in that other quote, you know, where was I to go? What was I to do? Everybody else I knew was 16 or 17, and they didn't have the ability to help me either. So not only for that reason, but for these other harms that can result, to be wary of any of these marriages that are entered underage. And so just to touch on the differences in some of those laws, again, 18 is that best threshold to be sure that you are empowering someone as much as possible. You won't prevent all the problems that resulted in an early marriage. Many child brides come from poverty, but you may keep them from remaining in poverty. You may give them that fighting chance at a better life and at choosing for themselves whether, when, and whom to marry. But a lot of the provisions that have been built into some of these other states' laws where we've seen those robust results have directly taken on some of these things. They've struck parental consent pregnancy exceptions. They've looked at age differences. They've ensured that someone with a violent criminal history who's an adult, and perhaps someone who might have been the teacher or counselor, as in Donna's case, can't be the intended spouse. So it takes an awful lot of due diligence to get that formula right, though, and you could still be missing things. So that's why we, again, keep coming back to this important refrain around 18 being an important dividing line.
Wonderful. Donna or Drew, would you care to comment on any of that? Or shall I go to next questions?
You can go to the next question. Jeannie always takes care of these things. She does great. Thanks, Jeannie.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a question about the international figure that I referenced and I don't think I cited, which is terrible practice, on the 12 million girls married annually. Where can we find that data? That is UN data, and specifically the UN Agency for Children, UNICEF. They do wonderful work, and that does include country by country totals. Of course, in most of the rest of the world, the age of marriage is set at federal level, so it's easier to reform marriage laws. We have 50 states, and they were all different, and so that's an important difference there. Some questions here about whether or not there are existing efforts underway to reform these legal loopholes in terms of pregnancy, consent, and otherwise, and also just what we can do about it. I was wondering, Jeannie, if you would just bottom line again, in your experience in terms of what has worked for other states in terms of reducing numbers, and your plans moving forward in terms of working with McGuire-Woods. I would just like to underscore here that ICRW is a research organization and will not be lobbying at the state level. So we're super delighted to be able to partner with folks who understand the legislative mechanics and ins and outs.
Right, so right now we are working, the Tahirih Justice Center is working with McGuire-Woods to explore what those legislative prospects can be in North Carolina. We're very excited that we're finally at this place, as Drew mentioned, while of course, just one case should be enough to motivate change. And some of these data sets are well available about what the harms are. We are now, only now really, in a position to demonstrate for North Carolina what these laws have meant and what the fallout has been. And so in other states, what we have pulled together successfully has been a broad-based bipartisan coalition, advocates for the rights of women, for girls, for the protection of children from child abuse, human trafficking advocates, those who work on domestic violence, sexual assault, because frankly, this is an issue where all of those concerns converge. And so that's what we're hoping to duplicate again here in North Carolina. And we've also partnered with survivor advocates like Donna, and Donna is in a position with Survivors Corner to support other courageous survivors who may wish to come forward and tell their stories and to likewise make change. And we've been truly privileged to work with a number of these advocates in states around the country. And that's really what it takes. That's the magic formula, to bring it all to the fore and to drive it across the finish line.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. We are at time. So what I'll just say is that we did record the webinar and we're happy to circulate it It will be available for your use. All of the ICRW data that was mentioned or research is on our website as well as the solutions to end child marriage paper that I think a number of the questions have been interested in. What is the role of faith groups? What is the role of the law? What is the role of family? The answer is we all have a role to play, and there's more details on our website. I'm so grateful to the speakers who've joined us and shared their insights and expertise today, and for your partnership on addressing this issue in our home state. I'm also very grateful to the North Carolina Council for Women and for their partnership on this launch event. And in that regard, would like to turn it back to Secretary Sanders to close us out. Secretary?
Yes, thank you, Lyric, and I echo your acknowledgments and thanks to everyone who participated today. Donna, thank you for your strength, courage, your resilience, and you definitely, I believe, represent the best of us women with the traits that you have demonstrated. And there is power in your story, and there's also power that you bring, I believe, with your presence. And with that power, you're already changing the world and changing this situation. And I wish you all the best in all that you do. And I hope that you will let that power and all of those traits that have happened in a horrific time really elevate you to soar to reach the highest heights that you may dream of. And I want to take that special time to acknowledge you. So thank you so much for that. And thank you. Thank you all for the meaningful conversation and discussion today, and for helping bring awareness to North Carolina's need for stronger child protections through your research. As a mother of 2 girls, I cannot imagine how stymied their education, their health, their well-being, and their future lives would be if stolen away from them by marriage at the age of 14. For far too long, we've held on to antiquated civil law on the books, and one that has contributed to social inequities, caused imbalance of power, opened door to human trafficking, sexual assault, and other predatory behaviors. And as we find ourselves in this historic time grappling with issues of disparity, inclusivity, and inequity, it is our collective duty of all of us to call attention to the power imbalance that child marriage brings, and between child brides and their typically much older adult partners. Knowledge is power, and knowledge can lead to change. And it's high time to protect all women and all children in our state. Women's issues are not and are never just a women's issue. They are also family issues, they are community issues, there are economic issues, and they are issues that affect not only our current state, but our future state. We must protect and support them. And the children of today will be the leaders of tomorrow, is what we often have said, but the children of today are the leaders of today. And we must do everything that we can to protect and to support them, to protect them from the harm and the danger and the torture and trauma that we've just heard a snippet of today. And again, many thanks to ICRW and to the Tahiri Justice Center for their research and for sharing data with us today. I look forward to working with the governor and legislators to change the trajectory for North Carolina's children and young girls. And together with North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement, we stand proud to partner with these organizations to not only help raise awareness, but to make a real change and impact for the lives of little girls across North Carolina, to help ensure that they have the opportunity for a good and prosperous life. Whether that be our nieces, our daughters, our granddaughters, our unborn daughters of the world and of this nation, we owe them that. And we owe it to ourselves. We owe that to ourselves. We owe that to our society. And we surely owe it to all the children around this nation who are counting on and looking for just protection, just a voice and an advocate, and just someone to stand and to stand firmly and to stand up boldly for them. So our children need us, our girls need us, North Carolina needs us, our nation needs us, and we need each other to advocate for the solutions to prevent and end child marriage. There are solutions that have been availed to us, and there probably are many more. And as Lyric said earlier, it takes a village, and it's going to take all of us. And I stand with all of those who will work to end child marriage and stand with you to make this a better society and a better state, and surely we can do better. So thank you all for your participation. I look forward to working on next steps. And again, Lyric and Jeannie, thank you for your leadership. And thank you for raising this in North Carolina. And now let's do something more about it. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day. Stay safe.